it's almost impossible to predict where the White House is going to go, not just on this issue, but on a lot of issues. I do find it hard to imagine the scenario where President Trump says, "Okay, I'm going to upgun the Ukrainians, keep them in the fight." After all this talk and emphasis on getting to a peace settlement, so I find that difficult. I take your point about the difficulty of further economic leverage. There is a ridiculously low level of trade at this point, so the tariffs, that's why they're off the list anyway. They weren't even included on the list of tariffs. But if you could dry up the oil revenues, then you're talking a good game. But that then implies that you can somehow figure out how to get China, to act and to not be as supportive as they have been of Russia. Do you see that as a possibility?
I see it as a possibility to be explored. I mean, you could work with OPEC. I mean, that's what Ronald Reagan did back in the 80s. We worked with OPEC, drive down the price of oil. That in combination with the Russians losing a lot in their war in Afghanistan, those helped put in the final nails in the coffin of the Soviet Union. So I'm not going to say it's not possible, but what I will say is that the maximum pressure campaign that is necessary to get the Russians to back down is not achievable with economic tools alone.
Mm-hmm.
The main driver of the Russian pressure points are their losses in Ukraine. And so if we're going to talk about how do we get the Russians to a better spot, the strategy I think it should include economic instruments like trying to bring down the price of oil. But that should be in addition to the sustained military support. Now, I remain hopeful that we can do it, especially if we can get the minerals deal signed, because then that could become a mechanism through which the Ukrainians are not the recipients of military aid for free, but the minerals deal can then become a means of financing purchases. So the Ukrainian customer.
That minerals deal is an interesting one because I've read an awful lot of material that talks about where the where the critical resources are located, and a lot of them are sitting in territory, the 20% or so of territory held by the Russians at this point.
Right. And that's very interesting when you bring that up, when you especially mentioned that President Trump just a couple of weeks ago was talking about how he would like to have American personnel operating Ukraine's Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, which is in Russian-occupied territory as well, which implies negotiations or warfighting that has to come under Ukrainian and then American jurisdiction. I'm not sure what the Trump administration is thinking about how that's possible, but if we're in a world where the Ukrainians and U.S. Americans get some of those minerals, and you get Americans defending Europe's largest nuclear power plant, and the Russians' front line goes closer to Russia and further away from mainland Ukraine, that's a win in my book. So we'll see.
Sure. I think that's a very optimistic scenario. I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but now what about the EU? We've kind of haven't touched on them yet, but if, as an example, here's a scenario: the White House, is reluctant to keep Ukraine in the fight, but they are willing to do whatever is possible in terms of the economic leverage. And maybe you turn to China and say, look, well, let's sit down at the table. I'll bet we could come up with a fair trade deal that would also include you not, supporting the Russian oil industry. Maybe you tie those two things together. But can the EU actually pick up the slack? Would the EU be in a position, in other words, to keep them in the fight?
Independently, just using the European defense industrial base, at this time, no. And the reason why is because, look, the Europeans have money. Money is not the issue, but a lot of it has to actually do with the manufacturing capacity.
Right.
Europeans are doing a lot in recent years to augment their defense industrial base, but as is with all things European, too little, too late. And when you need a factory today, you need to start breaking ground on the factory 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah.
And so the timelines aren't exactly lining up. Europeans are expediting it. I believe the European Commission, they're currently talking about a decades-long European rearmament initiative where they're going to spend somewhere around 800 billion euros to invest in the European defense industrial base. That's excellent. Again, needed to happen 10 years ago, but here we are. Now, that said, Europeans can do a lot. They produce a lot of artillery ammunition. They produce a lot of sort of working good stuff. Rheinmetall can make armored fighting vehicles and tanks. So in principle, that stuff we get to Ukraine, but there's some niche systems and capabilities that truly only the U.S. has, that the Europeans cannot replicate. Two systems come to mind. The interceptors for the Patriot air defense system.
Right.
I mean, Europeans themselves depend on the Patriots. It's kind of bizarre how the Americans have a monopoly over European air defense. And the Ukrainians are running low on those. The Europeans barely have any spare that they can give the Ukrainians that they haven't already. The American production rate of Patriot interceptors is actually quite low too. And so no more American aid, no more Patriot interceptors. That's going to be a big problem for Ukraine. Number two is the HIMARS for their operational strike capacity. The Ukrainians rely on the HIMARS. It has become a workhorse capability. It is the only system they have for reliable, effective operational range strikes, those being strikes beyond 30 kilometers, but sort of short of 70, 75 kilometers. The Europeans do not have a commensurate, mature system like the HIMARS to be able to fulfill that very important need. So even if the Europeans want to throw a lot of money and try to build stuff, they need that stuff.
Right.
And the solution might be that the Europeans just go to the Americans and go to Northrop Grumman and go to Lockheed, and they're like, hey, we'll pay you at General Dynamics. Like, hey, we'll pay you to give us the interceptors and the HIMARS ammo. And then they'll give it to the Ukrainians that way, which in principle could work and would benefit the U.S. industry too.
Hey, thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and leave a comment, a really positive, nice, and kind comment. That would be appreciated. And if you're not already subscribed to our channel, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our daily updates.